I'm talking about name, number, and the foundation of consciousness. And my interest is in meaning and how meaning relates to consciousness. And it's fundamentally based on the idea that our understanding of languages is really awry. So the paradigm is wrong. And so if you're wedded in any way to the current paradigm we have about what a language is, this is going to be very disturbing. So this is basically the outline. I can't advance the... No, okay, I've got it. Yeah, got it, thank you. All right, so a short introduction just to explain here why I think that the paradigm around languages is really lacking and why we need to change the paradigm. And then I'll talk about what is consciousness and when do we acquire it. And then I'll look at the architecture of consciousness. And this actually comes from Carl Jung, something he said 70 years ago in a book called Aion, Researches on the Phenomenology of Self. Then I'll look at the architecture of a meaning system, and this is based on my research. So when I'm talking about the architecture of a meaning system, it's my research into meaning. And then a few comments about number in meaning, you know, to acknowledge that this is a mathematics conference. And then a conclusion, which is just a painting from a German painter, which says something about consciousness, albeit nonverbal. Okay, so this is, God, what is going on here? Yeah. So I've lost my notes again. Are you able to? This is very frustrating, sorry. So I need to get my notes.
Notes are on this one?
Yes. All right, yes. So if I just tap through. But it doesn't advance.
I think what you have to do to advance your notes
is just click on the notes. Yeah.
Click on that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah, no, it's fine. All right, so this is very frustrating. But anyway, so our idea of what a language is very limited. It roughly conforms to the spoken word and written symbols on a page. And that's generally what we think about when we think about a language. And the piece that's missing, completely missing, is what I'm calling a meaning system. So bring it in here. So this is the other dimension of languages, and it's the most important dimension of a language. I mean, what the output is you know, what you see on the page, the utterances in the ether. But what really counts in language is the meaning that's conveyed. That's the significant part. And no one talks about it because no one knows anything about it because it's a black box in the unconscious. So it flies under the radar because it operates autonomously, out of sight, out of mind, like the nervous system, which is, you know, again, unconscious, and we take it for granted. But despite flying under the radar, this dimension of languages represents what's truly important. It's the engine room of meaning. And it functions, one, to download meaning into words at the command of the speaker or the thinker. Two, to decode that meaning if you're a listener, hearer. And then what I discovered, it does more than this. It also assigns meaning to consonants within a word on the basis of their relative position in the structure of a word. Somewhat akin to the function of place value, you could say, with the number system. So the key thing to note here is that unlike the external forms of a language represented in the blue circle, which is outside of you in the form of sound waves in the ether and symbols on the page, you actually live inside an interactive model of meaning, and you don't even know it. You live inside it. Once you acquired consciousness, you're living in this bubble. You didn't realize that you're putting on a virtual headset, basically, when you acquired consciousness, and that you didn't realize either that once the headset was affixed, you couldn't remove it anymore. So you've been living with this headset on ever since you became conscious. And I'll talk about when that happened. So you don't even know that you're seeing the world through a filter because you have no memory of time and place when you perceive things any differently. I call this meaning system the tree of meaning, or TOM for short, because in my research, it reveals that it's configured like a tree. And I'll get onto that when I talk about my research. But my research reveals something more interesting about the tree, and that's that it bears another fruit besides meaning. In other words, meaning is downloaded into words. The other fruit that it bears is consciousness. And that is stunning. I wasn't expecting that. I was studying meaning and how meaning is instantiated in words. And then I found the structure that yields consciousness. So I know that that's a bold claim, but bear with me. Okay, so here I'm switching from a left brain kind of an analysis to right brain. And you have to do that. That's the paradigm shift. You have to switch to right brain to understand this stuff. Left brain gets all involved in the weeds. Right brain understands what's going on. So having set the stage for the talk with some contextual background, I want to turn my attention to the phenomenon of consciousness itself and ask, what is it and where does it come from? I posed the first question in the slide on a paper I wrote a number of years ago. And the question boils down to, how is it that I'm able to distinguish what is me from what is not me? How do we do that? In other words, how do I know that I'm not identical with you, or the chair, or the table, or the wall? And to make this question pertinent to each of you in the room, ask yourselves, how do you know that you're not the person sitting next to you? That's a fundamental question for consciousness.
I can't move his arm, I can move mine.
Yeah, okay, so we'll come on to that. So how am I able to make that distinction? And you might be thinking, well, it's bloody obvious, right? That's what you're saying, it's obvious. But my question is, how do you know? It might seem bloody obvious, but it turns out to be a challenging question. What I'm trying to get at here is the following. Where does your sense of self and separation from other come from, and why does that matter? Okay, so where does the sense of self come from? If we're truly to understand consciousness, we have to account for the subjectivity of self, the sense that we all have of being separate from others, from our own bodies, and from the physical environment that surrounds us. You might have been moved in response to my absurd questions in the previous slide that you can see with your own eyes that your neighbor is separate from you. But the physical eye doesn't see anything. Our eyes are processors of ambient light, and seeing is a percept, as are hearing, tasting, touching, and smelling. They're all percepts of the mind. The actual senses are just data. It's just an input program. And it's your mind, it's the percept seeing that sees anything. And that is an internal coordinate of meaning. That's an internal coordinate of meaning. So what allows you to see anything is the inner eye, or the witnessing eye, not the physical eye, which, as I say, which is an internal coordinate of the system of meaning. It's this inner eye that synthesizes and interprets information from the senses and tells you that you're separate from other people and from other objects as a product of the internal dimension of the language. The inner eye has a point of view relative to the world that an undifferentiated entity can't have. So I'm saying you have to have this inner meaning system to make that distinction between self and other. And as an aside, it's interesting to note too that we use I and I, the same word for something, and I think we tend to think of the physical eye as being the dominant one, but I'm saying it's the inner eye. It's the inner eye that counts. That's what sees anything. Okay, so now I'm just going to bring up some text here which shows something very interesting. So you can see from the italic text at the foot of the slide that the names of our closest familial relationships are predicated on the dichotomy between the inner I and other. Of course, I understand that this is just English, and each individual language will have its own internal logic as far as naming goes, but all languages will of necessity separate self and other, that distinction. To say otherwise would mean we would be saying there are certain peoples who are not conscious, because I'm saying that this is the essence of consciousness, this separation self and other. So you can't argue, I'm saying it's in all languages and it's in all meaning systems, and whatever the internal logic is of English as opposed to Russian or German, they're all going to separate I, the inner I, from what is other. And basically everything in the world is other than the I. So the desk, the person over there, the wall, everything you see as an entity, a separate entity out there, is classified as another in the internal meaning system. So you can see this being the case, and to take my argument, the meaning system is operating as an organ of perception, and it's the significant organ of perception because it's combining all the other senses into one. So I just noted here that I'm not the only person to say that this meaning system is, or languages are the basis of our organs of perception. Julian Jaynes said the same thing in his 1976 book, The Origins of Consciousness in the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind. Okay, so in the previous slide, I asked, where did this sense of self and other come from? And I think I've answered that question. It comes directly from the internal meaning system underlying a language. Now I want to talk about why it matters. Okay, the reason it matters is that the separation of self and other is the foundation of consciousness. That's how we're conscious, that we see ourselves as separate. You can intuitively see that if you're physiologically or psychologically the same as or identical with someone else or something else, then by definition you can't see them in the terms we're talking about because there's no separation between the two of you. You're one. You have to have a separate self to see with. And if I'm unable to distinguish self from other, there's no I to witness the other. So the implications of this line of reasoning are profound, as you can see. It means objects are non-conscious. It means animals are non-conscious because they don't have the mechanism, the linguistic meaning system to separate themselves. And that's kind of maybe a radical suggestion, but the fact is that I think that we project onto animals and we want to think that our beloved pets are conscious, but if this is right, they're not conscious. And the other thing to note here is that physical separation alone is a necessary condition for consciousness, but not sufficient. Okay, so here's the question. Are you conscious in utero or at birth? The previous discussion about consciousness raises the question, well, we're conscious now, but have we always been conscious? When did we become conscious? Would you mind shutting the door? So if we look at the time, thank you. If we look at the timeline of our life, and if the litmus test for consciousness is knowing that you're separate from the other, from all others, whether they be human others or the door jamb, then there's clearly a time that you didn't possess that degree of self-awareness, a time when you couldn't distinguish between what was you and what was not you. So are you conscious in utero or at birth? I say no. The window opens when the meaning system is activated. And here it's activated after birth, somewhere in the second year, I think, although I would leave that to the experts to determine when that exactly happens. So the activation of the meaning system happens by the interaction of people speaking with you, triggers the system, which is inbuilt. It's innate, it just needs to be triggered. And then after the activation of the meaning system, you'll have me as an object appear, and then later I as a subject. That's kind of a normal transition. Okay, so now we're moving on to the architecture of consciousness. And this seems profoundly simple, but in a way it is profoundly simple. The architecture of consciousness requires separation of self from other, and it requires a third element which Jung recognized, which was a relationship between the two. So, 5 minutes? Holy crap. Okay, so below the red line is identity of opposites. So there is no subject, no self, and you have to go above the line where the bifurcation occurs, and you see the subject and object. All right, so this is more of my research into the architecture of a meaning system, and there's a lot to say about this, and I'm happy to share with anyone who's interested. But basically, I think this is the architecture of the system. It starts with the concept one down here, and words name concepts, and every concept bifurcates into two concepts, because when you think about it, concepts come in pairs, up and down, left and right, life and death. So these concepts come into the system at the same time. There's no other way for that to happen. If I bring up into my life, down is the other side of that. So they come into the system at the same time. And I'm just going to show you here that a meaning is internal to the system. It's not something that you have to look at historically, the etymology of words. The meaning is coming directly from the system. So I'm going to give you, this is an example of a circle or cycle. So the concept is circle or cycle, and I'm saying whenever you have a doubling of an n, one of the meanings that comes out of that is written in these words, encoded in the following words: annulate, annual, anniversary. Now these are not surprising, but this one might be surprising. 9, 2 n's together, that's the cycle of single digits. And then this one, even more surprising maybe, circle or cycle encoded in the word onion. Slice an onion in half and you understand why that's a circle or cycle. Okay, so now I do need to say something about this slide here. So this slide is, I'm just going to quote something that I wrote here. My inquiry into how meaning is instantiated in words in English reveals that behind the inherent complexity of sound-meaning relations that we colloquially call English lies an archetypal map to meaning that documents the emergence and developmental growth of the language from a meaning-centered perspective. So it takes it right out of space-time. The English language, that's the structure of it. You can investigate how it was at the beginning, and you can investigate how it was at any time. The meaning system, even though the language itself changes all the time, the inner meaning system is stable. And it has to be stable because it relies on us talking to each other and trading in sound meaning units that are the same. So that tree underlying English, for me, if you speak English, you have that tree in your head already. So there's no question of things being slotted or have to be remembered. When I say a word, it lights up the tree for you, and it's automatic and reflexive. Okay, so there are a lot of substantive things I could say about the tree, and happy to share them with people if they're interested. But my main purpose here is to point out that the tree of meaning fulfills all three of the preconditions to consciousness identified by Jung. So in terms of the architecture I showed you, you've got the subject-self branch here, object not me branch, and the relationship between the two. That's the architecture you need for consciousness to exist. And although this meaning-centered map is distilled from my research into the matrix of sound meaning relations in English, it's going to apply to every language. They use different sounds, a different combination of sounds, and there will be a different internal logic, but they're all going to have this fundamental division in there. And then one thing that I just invite you to do is stand in the eye there and look out at the world. This is what you see. If you stand in the eye position, you look out in the world, everything is a space or time object, and everything is a one in that world with a name. Doesn't matter what it is. And because the system bifurcates from the initial concept one, everything is nested in one. And that, I'm saying, that influences the way you see the world. If you look around, you see ones nested in ones. And so this is affecting the lens through which you see the world. All right, I just have a couple of more slides here. All right, so the significance of one. No one knows this. One day, that's the arc of the sun, the path of the sun. That arc of the sun and the polarity represented by beginning and end and the transition is represented in the lowercase n and the sound n in any language that uses Roman symbols. And this uppercase n is the same thing. It's showing you, this is a shared bar here, but it's showing you that there's a negative and a positive vector. So the essence, the nature of oneness is polarity. And if you think about it, there's no exceptions to that. You think about a human being, there's up, down, left, right, inside, outside. If you think about an object, up, down, left, right. If you think about time, before, after, earlier, later. So that's built into the meaning system. That is key. It's built into the meaning system. And it all goes back to the fact the system is built on oneness, everything being a one. All right, and this is just my rendition of, because one is foundational, this is the primary bifurcation here. On the left, you have n at the end of a word, and if you look at the English language, the predominant endings are with n, Ion, An, Aion. That's the majority of endings. That means one. But when you have the n at the beginning of a word, indeterminate, undistinguished, that tells you it's negation. So word beginnings signify negation, word endings signify unity. And again, to emphasize, meaning is coming right out of the meaning system, and you don't even know about it. You're unconscious about it. And that's because you became conscious when the meaning system was activated. You can't remember anything prior to that. And that's guaranteed because no meaning attaches to an undifferentiated being. And this is the proof of the pudding. The tree that Adam and Eve ate from in the garden, this is called in the Bible the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. That is the tree. That's the tree of meaning, what I'm calling the tree of meaning. When they eat the apple, they become conscious, and they're cast out of the garden. And if you look at this picture, this is a painting by Lucas Cranach the Elder, is a German Renaissance painter. It's painted in 1526. This picture is littered with symbolism here, and it's all about duality: man, woman, animal, human, the snake, and he's telling us the story of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, but I'm translating it for you into meaning is what makes us conscious. And why it's such a struggle for us to find out and talk about consciousness is that we're not even aware that it's coming from back there. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.